They told you these war movies were flawed, overblown, even unworthy of the praise audiences gave them. But what if the critics missed the point completely? What if some of the most gripping war films of the 1960s survived not because reviews were kind, but because viewers felt something deeper in them? Tonight we uncover 15 war movies critics pushed aside, but audiences refused to forget. And the final entries may change how you judge war cinema forever. Anzio, 1968. At first glance, Anzio looks like a war epic trying to compete with giants. Big names, big budget, big expectations. And yet, critics didn't buy it. They called it uneven, disconnected, a film that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. But here's what they missed. Anzio doesn't glorify war. It exposes its paralysis. It traps you in a campaign that should have been a decisive Allied victory, but instead became a slow, grinding stalemate. And that frustration, that confusion, that sense of missed opportunity, it's not a flaw, it's the point. Audiences felt that, because beneath the surface spectacle is something far more uncomfortable. A story about hesitation, about leadership failures, about how wars are not just won by courage, but lost through indecision. Robert Mitchum's performance carries a quiet weight. A man observing chaos unfold with a growing sense of inevitability. Critics wanted clarity. Audiences got something closer to truth. And over time, that truth has aged better than any polished narrative ever could. Von Ryan's Express, 1965. There's something almost deceptive about Von Ryan's Express. On the surface, and it plays like a classic wartime adventure. Escape, strategy, survival. Critics appreciated it, but they didn't feel its full impact. Audiences did. Because what starts as a simple POW escape turns into something far more intense. A journey where trust becomes fragile, leadership becomes controversial, and survival demands uncomfortable choices. Frank Sinatra doesn't play a traditional hero here. He plays a man forced into authority, making decisions that don't always feel right, but feel necessary. And that's where the tension lives. The film slowly tightens its grip, turning a moving train into a ticking clock. Every mile forward feels like borrowed time. Every decision carries consequences. And by the time it reaches its ending, it doesn't reward you. It hits you. Critics saw a solid war film. Audiences experienced something more personal, the cost of leadership, the burden of responsibility, and the realization that not every victory feels like one. The Heroes of Telemark, 1965. The Heroes of Telemark should have been an easy win, a true story, a Nazi nuclear threat, a resistance mission that could change the course of history. So, why didn't critics fully embrace it? Because they focused on what it wasn't, tight, fast, explosive. But audiences focused on what it was, patient, calculated, and terrifyingly real. This isn't a story about soldiers charging into battle. It's about scientists and resistance fighters carrying the weight of a world that could end if they fail. The stakes are quiet, but absolute. Kirk Douglas and Richard Harris don't play invincible heroes. They play men under pressure, at navigating a mission where one mistake doesn't just mean death. It means catastrophe on a global scale. And that tension builds slowly. The snow, the silence, the constant awareness that the enemy is always watching. It's not loud warfare. It's psychological warfare. Critics wanted excitement. Audiences felt the dread. And that dread lingers long after the film ends. Hell is for Heroes, 1962. Hell is for Heroes doesn't feel like a war movie trying to impress you. And that's exactly why critics didn't fully embrace it. They saw something too small, too contained. A film without the grand-scale audiences had come to expect from World War II stories. No massive offensives, no sweeping victories, just a handful of soldiers, holding a line that barely exists. But that limitation becomes its greatest strength. Because Hell is for Heroes traps you in stillness, in waiting, in the kind of silence where every sound feels like a threat. Steve McQueen's performance isn't loud or heroic. It's distant, controlled, almost detached. A soldier shaped by war, not inspired by it, and that discomfort builds slowly. The enemy is out there, watching, probing, and the longer nothing happens, the more unbearable it becomes. Critics wanted action, audiences felt tension, because sometimes the most terrifying part of war isn't the battle. It's the moment right before it begins. The Longest Day, 1962. On paper, The Longest Day had everything critics should have loved: an all-star cast, a massive retelling of D-Day, multiple perspectives woven into one historic event. And yet, some critics found it overwhelming, too sprawling, too fragmented. It's a film that tried to show everything, but risked making you feel nothing. But audiences experienced something completely different. They experienced scale, because The Longest Day doesn't focus on one hero. It shows you hundreds. Soldiers landing on beaches, paratroopers dropping into darkness, commanders making decisions that ripple across an entire invasion. It doesn't guide your emotions. It immerses you. You don't watch D-Day unfold. You feel lost inside it. The confusion, the chaos, the sense that no one fully understands what's happening in the moment. And that's what makes it powerful. Critics wanted a tighter story. Audiences witnessed history in motion. Because sometimes war isn't meant to be simplified. It's meant to be overwhelming. PT-109, 1963. PT-109 carried a burden from the very beginning. And it wasn't just a war story. It was tied to a real figure, a future president, a narrative already shaped by history. And critics saw that as a problem. They questioned its sincerity, its tone, whether it was telling a story or protecting a legacy. But audiences saw something else. They saw survival. Cliff Robertson's portrayal of John F. Kennedy isn't built on grand heroics. It's built on endurance. A man pushed into a situation where leadership isn't optional, it's necessary. When the PT boat is destroyed, the film shifts completely. Now, it's not about war strategy. It's about staying alive. Open water, injured men, no clear rescue. Just the slow realization that survival will depend on willpower more than anything else. Critics focused on its political shadow. Audiences connected with its human struggle. Because stripped of context, stripped of history, it becomes something simple and powerful. A story about refusing to give up when everything says you should. The Guns of Navarone, 1961. The Guns of Navarone should have been untouchable. A mission film with massive stakes. A team of specialists, an objective that feels impossible from the start. And yet, critics weren't fully convinced. Some saw it as too conventional, too focused on adventure rather than realism, a war story that leaned into spectacle instead of truth. But audiences, they were completely locked in. Because the Guns of Navarone understands something fundamental. Tension isn't just about realism, it's about stakes. Every step of the mission feels fragile. Climbing cliffs in darkness, moving through enemy territory. They're facing obstacles that don't just threaten failure, but total annihilation. Gregory Peck leads with quiet intensity, but the real strength comes from the group dynamic. Different personalities, different motivations, all forced to trust each other when trust feels dangerous. And as the mission unfolds, the pressure builds. Because this isn't just about success, it's about whether they'll make it out alive. Critics saw a formula, audiences felt the suspense. And that suspense is what turned the Guns of Navarone into something far more enduring than critics ever expected. Where Eagles Dare, 1968. From the moment where Eagles Dare begins, you know something isn't right. A mission behind enemy lines, a fortress in the mountains, a team that doesn't fully trust each other. Critics called it convoluted, overcomplicated, and too many twists. But that's exactly why audiences couldn't look away. Because this isn't just a war film, it's a game of deception. Every character feels like they're hiding something. Every line of dialogue feels like it could mean more than it says. And just when you think you understand what's happening, the film pulls the rug out from under you. Clint Eastwood and Richard Burton move through the story like pieces on a chessboard. But the real tension comes from not knowing who's playing which side. It's not about the action, it's about the uncertainty. Who can you trust? What is the real mission? And how many layers of lies are you watching unfold? Critics saw confusion. Audiences saw complexity. And that complexity is what keeps pulling viewers back, trying to unravel the truth one more time. The Dirty Dozen, 1967. The Dirty Dozen didn't just challenge expectations, it shattered them. Critics at the time were uneasy. The violence felt excessive. The tone felt rebellious. These weren't heroes, they were criminals, killers, men chosen not for honor, but for expendability. And that made people uncomfortable, but audiences, they embraced it. Because for the first time, a war film didn't pretend that all soldiers were noble. It showed something raw, that sometimes the people sent to fight are already broken, already dangerous, already lost. Lee Marvin's commanding presence turns chaos into strategy. But even he knows this mission is different. This isn't about winning cleanly. It's about surviving something ugly. And that final act? It doesn't feel heroic. It feels ruthless. Critics questioned its morality. Audiences understood its honesty. And in doing so, The Dirty Dozen became something more than a war movie. It became a turning point. Battle of the Bulge, 1965. Battle of the Bulge was supposed to be definitive, a massive retelling of one of World War II's most crucial battles. Tanks, strategy, scale. It had everything critics usually demand. And yet, they turned on it. They called it inaccurate. They pointed out the wrong locations, the missing snow, the liberties taken with history. To them, it wasn't authentic enough, but audiences didn't care about the details. They cared about the experience. Because what Battle of the Bulge delivers is something critics often overlook, a sense of overwhelming force, the kind of cinematic pressure where you can feel the weight of advancing armor, the desperation of soldiers caught in something bigger than themselves. The film doesn't just show a battle, it builds momentum. You watch the German offensive roll forward like an unstoppable machine, and for a moment, you feel what the Allies must have felt: uncertainty, fear, the terrifying possibility of losing ground. And then there's Robert Shaw. Cold, calculated, almost hypnotic in his control. His performance doesn't shout, it simmers. A commander who believes in strategy over chaos, making him more dangerous than any explosion on screen. Critics saw flaws in the facts. Audiences felt the scale of war. And over time, that scale, the sheer cinematic force of it, has kept Battle of the Bulge alive in a way accuracy debates never could. Because sometimes, it's not about recreating history perfectly. It's about making you feel like you're inside it. The Devil's Brigade, 1968. You see, the Devil's Brigade isn't the kind of war film critics usually celebrate. They wanted polish, structure, a clear heroic arc. What they got instead felt uneven to them, too loose, too focused on character instead of spectacle. But that's exactly why audiences connected with it. Because this isn't a story about perfect soldiers, it's about incompatible ones. Americans and Canadians forced together, clashing in culture, discipline, and identity. At first, they don't feel like a unit at all. They feel like a problem waiting to explode. And that tension drives everything. William Holden plays a commander trying to shape chaos into cohesion. Not with grand speeches, but with pressure, expectation, and the slow realization that unity isn't given. It's built. The training sequences aren't just preparation. They're transformation. You watch men who don't trust each other slowly become something dangerous together. And when they finally enter combat, it's not glorious. It's earned. Critics saw inconsistency. Audiences saw authenticity. Because real units aren't formed overnight. Real bonds aren't clean or cinematic. They're messy, resistant, hard-won. And the Devil's Brigade understands that in a way many perfect war films never do. Battle of Britain, 1969. There's something almost overwhelming about Battle of Britain, not because it tries to manipulate you, but because it refuses to. Critics at the time called it distant, too procedural, lacking emotional focus. They wanted a central hero, a story to hold on to. But that's not what this film gives you. Instead, it gives you scale, a nation under threat, a sky filled with machines. Yeah, and a battle where survival doesn't depend on one man, but on hundreds making split-second decisions at unimaginable speeds. The film doesn't slow down to explain everything. It doesn't force emotional cues. It places you inside the system. Radar operators tracking blips, commanders making impossible calls, pilots scrambling with seconds to spare. And that realism creates its own kind of tension, because there's no guarantee of survival, no cinematic protection, just the constant hum of engines and the awareness that every flight could be the last. Audiences felt that immersion. They felt the repetition, the exhaustion, the quiet dread of waiting for the next wave. Critics saw a lack of intimacy. Audiences experienced something bigger than intimacy, a collective struggle where every individual matters, but no one controls the outcome. And that perspective is what makes Battle of Britain endure, because sometimes the most powerful war stories aren't about heroes, they're about survival. The Bridge at Remagen, 1969. The Bridge at Remagen doesn't feel like a victory story, and that's exactly why critics struggled with it. They wanted momentum, triumph, a clean narrative where the Allies push forward and the outcome feels inevitable. Instead, this film traps you in a moment where nothing feels certain. A single bridge, one strategic crossing, and two sides who both understand the same terrifying truth. Whoever controls it, controls what happens next. The tension isn't explosive, it's suffocating. George Segal plays an American officer pushing forward, driven by urgency. On the other side, Robert Vaughn delivers something far more unsettling. A German officer who isn't blinded by ideology, but by inevitability. He knows the war is lost, but orders don't disappear just because hope does. And that's where the film hits hardest. This isn't about winning, it's about delaying the end. Every decision feels temporary. Every victory feels fragile. And the closer the Allies get, the more desperate everything becomes. Critics called it uneven. Audiences felt the pressure. Because The Bridge at Remagen captures something most war films avoid, the final days of a conflict where nobody truly believes anymore, but the fighting refuses to stop. And that kind of tension doesn't fade. It lingers. 633 Squadron, 1964. 633 Squadron was dismissed as predictable, a straightforward mission film, a classic structure. And critics saw it as formula. Nothing new, nothing surprising, but audiences didn't come for surprise. They came for intensity. Because from the moment the mission is introduced, a near impossible attack on a heavily defended target, you already know what this film is building toward, and that's exactly what makes it powerful. It's not about what will happen. It's about how far they're willing to go to make it happen. The pilots aren't invincible. They're exposed, vulnerable, flying directly into a wall of fire with no guarantee of return. And the film doesn't rush that reality. It stretches it. Every approach feels longer. Every second in the air feels heavier. You feel the weight of the mission before the first shot is even fired. Cliff Robertson leads with quiet determination. But it's the collective tension of the squadron that drives the film. These aren't just individuals. They're pieces of a mission that demands sacrifice. Critics saw simplicity. Audiences felt inevitability. Because sometimes the most gripping stories aren't about twists. They're about watching people walk straight into danger, knowing exactly what it will cost. The Green Berets, 1968. This is the one critics couldn't stand. The Green Berets wasn't just criticized, it was attacked, dismissed as propaganda, accused of oversimplifying a war that was already tearing public opinion apart. But here's what makes it different. Audiences didn't reject it, they showed up. Because while critics focused on politics, audiences connected to something else entirely, perspective. This film didn't try to question the war. It showed the men inside it. John Wayne doesn't play a conflicted observer, and he plays conviction, certainty. A soldier who believes in what he's doing, even as the world around him starts to doubt everything. And that contrast creates tension. Because by 1968, America was divided. Protests were growing, trust was breaking. And here comes a film that refuses to reflect that uncertainty. Instead, it presents clarity. And whether you agree with that clarity or not, it's powerful. The film doesn't just show combat, it shows purpose, brotherhood, loss, and the emotional cost of fighting in a war that's no longer universally supported. Critics rejected its message, audiences responded to its emotion. Oh, and that divide between what people were told to think and what they actually felt is exactly why The Green Berets still sparks conversation today. Because sometimes the most controversial films aren't the ones that get everything right. They're the ones that refuse to bend. So maybe the critics were never the final word. Maybe the real test of a war film is not whether reviewers admired it in the moment, but whether audiences kept returning to it year after year. These 15 films were challenged, dismissed, and underestimated, yet they endured. And that raises the bigger question. How many other brilliant war movies were judged too quickly? Let me know which one deserved far more respect than it ever got.